you. Now, this is working? I've got the mute switch off. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out tonight to hear me talk about evil. I actually was kind of hesitant about putting evil in the title of the talk because I thought you might get the idea that I'm just going to sit here or stand here and list a series of horrible things for the whole night. And I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to, for one thing, I'm going to talk about something that I call moral imagination, which I think could actually, if exercised more, could reduce the number of horrible things in the world. At the same time, there are a lot of horrible things going on in the world, and these are, I think, pretty troubling times, and there are disturbing forces at work in the world and in the nation and in the nation's politics. So I think, we should grapple with bad things and why they happen. Now, you'll notice that when I mentioned disturbing forces in our national politics, I did not mention the words Donald Trump. That took a little self-restraint because personally I consider some of what he represents to be one of the disturbing things. But I also think that Trumpism is an example of, of some more general problems. And so I'm going to talk about these things at a more general level. I'm not going to, during the talk itself, I'm not going to get much into national politics. But I certainly, in the question and answer session afterwards, I encourage you to bring up any issues that you're concerned about, and I hope we will get into contemporary issues because there are plenty of them, and I like to think that what I'm going to talk about can be applied to the problems that we face today. Now, I'm going to, partly for the sake of getting to the question and answer session, I'm probably going to proceed fairly fast. If I proceed too fast, you can feel free to raise your hand. If you have a question that's just for clarification, it's just something you don't understand, feel free to stop me, or you can wait until the Q&A and ask for elaboration. But in any event, I'll try not to spend too much of your time before we can open it up to a little more in the way of a discussion. So I guess I got interested in the subject of evil back when George Bush delivered his Axis of Evil speech. I don't know how many of you remember that. This was in the run-up to the Iraq War. He declared Iraq a member of the Axis of Evil, and this was part of kind of paving the way for the war. And I wrote a piece for Slate, the online magazine, about the speech, and I was about as kind of dismissive of it as you might expect someone of my ideological persuasion to be, and as someone who went on to oppose the war. I guess I kind of mocked the idea. The way he was using the word evil, I thought was a little melodramatic. And I got criticized for this. There's a conservative blog called Instapundit. At the time, it was really one of the very most influential blogs in the conservative blogs in the country. So Glenn Reynolds, who writes in Instapundit, referred to my piece in Slate as, quote, both dumb and snide. And it probably was snide. I think it wasn't dumb. But that wasn't what I found most offensive, actually. He also wrote about my piece in Slate. He wrote, I think that what makes people cringe, and here he was talking about me, I think that what makes people cringe about good and evil discussions is that if you admit that good and evil exist, that creates obligations. To oppose evil and to support good, that's work and it involves responsibility. So he was kind of accusing me of not being serious enough to talk about, moral right and moral wrong, good and bad, in a very serious way. So I did get a little offended. I wrote him an email, and I tried to explain that in dismissing the idea of evil, I didn't mean to be dismissing the idea of morally bad behaviors. There are morally bad behaviors. There's moral good and moral bad and right and wrong, I think. But when I thought of the word evil, I thought of something other than just just something bad. And I also didn't just think of something really, really bad. That's the way a lot of people use the word evil. They just mean really, really bad. You know, like Hannibal Lecter in the movie Silence of the Lambs or something. Just something someone almost, you know, unimaginably bad. They'll call evil. Well, that's not what I had in mind when I criticized Bush's use of the word. What I was thinking of was a kind of more ancient sense of the word evil, where the idea is that there is some kind of supernatural force or metaphysical substance or something that's behind all the bad things, right? That causes all the bad things in the world. So the way I was thinking, to believe in evil isn't just to believe that bad things happen. Bad things definitely happen, and we can call them bad and we can call them wrong. But to believe in evil is to kind of think that there's this one thing behind them all. So evil in this view is a kind of a grand unified theory of bad. Okay, it's the idea that there's a single explanation behind everything bad that happens. And this didn't make sense to me. This seemed to me like kind of a relic of an earlier era. Now, in a certain sense, by the way, I don't know if how many of you are interested in the early history of Christian thought, but there was an idea around at the time of Augustine called Manichaeism, which was this idea that the world is a cosmic struggle. There's the force of evil and there's the force of good. This is cosmic struggle. And Augustine actually, although for a while he liked that idea, he ultimately dismissed it. That the idea that there was some single force behind all the bad things. And so this idea of like a force of evil was rejected, at least by this very influential Christian thinker. So I guess in that sense I was in good company in rejecting the idea myself. At the same time, there is something appealing in a sense about the idea of evil, right? The idea, if there really were one single thing behind all the bad things that happen in the world, at least you'd know what to focus your energy on, right? It would be, in a certain sense, efficient. I mean, I'm not a Lord of the Rings, groupie or anything, but I saw the movie, and the idea was that there's this place called Mordor, which was the home of Sauron, and this was the source of all the evil, and so that's what you focus your attack on, right? You've got one thing to attack to rid the world of bad. That would be nice. It's an appealing idea if we could just successfully assault one thing and be rid of bad. So it got me started thinking, well, is there such a thing as like a modern conception of evil? In other words, could I, within a basically scientific framework, argue that there's one thing, like a human psychological tendency or a misconception or some one thing that's behind all the bad things in the world? Well, I think the answer is no. That would actually be asking a little much. But still, we could ask, is there one thing that is behind much of the world's badness, that's behind many of the horrible things that happen? Or to put it in another way, what is the one thing that if you could change it, it would do the most good? Something about human nature or whatever. So, is there kind of a grand unified theory of bad or something close to it that is, you might say scientifically respectable? Well, so here's the candidate I came up with. And I put this out largely for the sake of argument, but I do think this accounts for a lot of the world's trouble. I think possibly the biggest source of badness in the world is the failure of people to put themselves in the shoes of other people, especially people who are very different from them, maybe culturally, ethnically, maybe in a different nation. Now, when you talk about putting yourself in the shoes of other people, the word empathy often springs to people's mind, right? And people think, oh, you mean empathize with people. And I do, but I mean it not just in the traditional sense, okay? So the traditional sense of empathy is, feeling people's pain, so feeling the emotions that they feel, that's the feel your pain empathy is what most people think of when they think of empathy. But psychologists talk about two kinds of empathy. And that kind of empathy they call emotional empathy, but there's a second kind of empathy that they call cognitive empathy. Okay? And cognitive empathy refers to just understanding the person's perspective taking, it's sometimes called. Just understanding the way the world looks to them. You don't have to empathize with them emotionally necessarily, but you understand like kind of why they're reacting the way they're reacting, what they're thinking, what they're, including what they're feeling, but not necessarily in a sympathetic way. Okay, so you could Vladimir Putin. If you're in the Pentagon, you probably should ask yourself, well, what's he thinking? And what's it like in that sense to be him? That is cognitive empathy, just perspective taking. Now, I think both kinds of empathy are important. I think the absence of emotional empathy has often caused bad things to happen because, I mean, after all, if you feel someone's pain, then you are almost inevitably kind of acknowledging their moral significance. You're considering if you're feeling it personally, you're kind of deeming the state of their minds significant. And the failure to acknowledge the moral significance of people or groups of people has obviously led to a lot of trouble. So I think emotional empathy is a very important thing. But I think cognitive empathy is an underrated thing. And I think often a failure to just put yourself in the shoes of other people in the sense of just understanding what's going on in their minds can lead to trouble. So I use the term moral imagination to refer to putting yourself in the shoes of other people, especially when it's challenging, especially when it's hard to do. Different people have used this term differently, but this is what I mean by moral imagination. Putting yourself in the shoes of other people, especially when it's not easy to do. Now, there are various reasons that it may not be easy to do. They may just be in very different circumstances from yours. You just kind of can't, it's just hard to imagine what it's like to be them. There may be other reasons that we'll come to. But I do think it's often when it's hardest to exercise moral imagination that exercising it would do the most good. And by way of example, I want to get back to this axis of evil thing, okay? The Iraq War that the axis of evil speech paved the way for. Now, as you may recall, the leader of the regime that President Bush called evil was Saddam Hussein. And in the run-up to the Iraq War, one thing you didn't hear a lot is, well, can we just look at things from Saddam Hussein's point of view? That wasn't a popular thing to do. But I think in retrospect, that could have saved us a lot of trouble. At least it might have saved us a lot of trouble, including a whole war and all the horrible things that have ensued in the aftermath of that war. Just to remind you what the situation was, we invaded Iraq because we thought he had a big weapons of mass destruction program. Now, he actually had allowed United Nations inspectors into his country, and he had allowed them to look at any facility they wanted to look at, and they hadn't found anything. So you might ask, well, why did we invade? And part of the answer is that there are a lot of reasons, I think, but part of the answer is that he was doing some other things that we considered suspicious, even though he was letting the UN inspectors in. So, for example, we had asked him, I think maybe this was even in a UN resolution, to let us take his scientists out of his country and interview them outside of Iraq, and he refused to do that, and people took that as evidence that he had something to hide, and so that just strengthened the case for going to war. Now, if you actually put yourself in his shoes, you can actually imagine a lot of reasons he might not want the scientists to leave the country. He may fear that they would defect. He might fear that they would spill the beans about something other than weapons of mass destruction. I think most likely is that he just didn't want to be humiliated anymore in front of his people. It had been very humiliating to let the UN inspectors in. He probably plausibly thought that would forestall the invasion, and he might not have wanted to be humiliated any further. In any event, if you really use your imagination, it's not hard to imagine tons of reasons he might not have wanted to let the scientists out of the country, but this was one of many things that we took as evidence that he had something to hide. And so we did invade, and lots of horrible things ensued. Now, I mean, ISIS, for example, would not exist. I mean, imagine the world without, imagine contemporary politics without ISIS, if there weren't ISIS to talk about. Well, ISIS almost certainly would not exist had it not been for the Iraq War. So why is moral imagination so hard? Well, as I said, sometimes it's just that it's hard to put yourself, it's just literally hard to imagine someone in being someone in very different circumstances for your own. So most of us don't have any experience being brutal dictators, as Saddam Hussein definitely was, and so it's just hard to do the exercise. But there are other reasons that it's sometimes hard to put yourself in the shoes of other people, and these reasons come under the general category of what psychologists call cognitive biases, okay? Cognitive biases have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. Probably the most famous one is confirmation bias, which just means that once you have an opinion and you've advanced a view on something, you notice evidence in favor of it and you don't notice evidence contrary to it. There was probably some of that going on, but I also think that there was a more subtle cognitive bias at play, and I think these biases are really important. So I want to talk about this. I think that they're relevant not only to the moral imagination question, but to the larger question of what you could call, I guess, tribalism, the psychology of tribalism, whether it's ideological tribalism, which you're seeing a lot of in America these days, bitter competition among differing ideologies, sectarian tribalism, Sunni Shia or Catholic Protestant in Ireland, or nation versus nation. I think these cognitive biases play an underrated role in contributing to this kind of conflict between groups. And there's one cognitive bias that fascinates me, and it hasn't gotten much attention, and it's slightly complicated, but bear with me. It has to do with what's called the fundamental attribution error. Now, the kind of basic version of the fundamental attribution error, which psychologists discovered several decades ago, is a tendency of people to attribute too much of a person's behavior to the kind of person they are, as opposed to the circumstances they're in. So, for example, if you're in a checkout line and you see somebody being rude to the person checking them out, you're probably just going to think, that person's a jerk, right? That's the reaction. You tend to pass that judgment and reach that conclusion about that person. Whereas, for all you know, they just got some horrible news about the death of a family member. You don't know why they were rude. And in fact, psychologists have shown that there's a tendency to underestimate the role of circumstance in what people do. Now, that was the original version of the fundamental attribution error. And then it turned out that actually it's a little more complicated than that. So whether you attribute people's behavior to the kind of person they are, that is their disposition, or to circumstance, situational factors like peer group pressure or various other things, it turns out that actually depends on the relationship of the person to you. Okay, so if you think of somebody as being on your team, it's a friend or a family member, then the way it tends to work is that if they do something good, you attribute it to their disposition, to the person. You say, yeah, that's the kind of person they are. They do good things. If they do something bad, you're more likely to explain it away with circumstance. So, for example, I have now daughters who are now grown, but I know if I was watching them on the playground when they were 4 or 5 years old and they did something bad to another kid, my tendency would be to think, well, it's because she didn't get her nap, right? Or she did that in reaction to something the kid had done to her. I didn't jump to the conclusion that my daughter is bad, right? We don't do that. Whereas if some rival of my daughter's did something bad, I was much more likely to go, yeah, that's a bad kid. Whereas if my daughter did something good, I'd go, yep, that's my daughter. That's the way she is. She does good stuff. Whereas her rival does something good, I'd say, well, she's just showing off. I don't mean I always did this, but parents are inclined. If you think about it, this is the way people read the world, and it turns out this is like a deep-seated human tendency. If it's a friend, an ally, then you interpret their behavior one way. If it's an enemy, you interpret their behavior another way. And that brings us back to Saddam Hussein, because everyone considered him the enemy. He had already been, it begins with the axis of evil speech in a way, right? I mean, the depicting of him as a horrible person, as an enemy. And look, he was a bad person. I'm not denying that. But I'm just saying that putting him in that category of enemy influences the way we interpreted his subsequent behavior. So, when he does something we consider bad, like refuse to let the scientists out of the country, we don't search, carefully for all the different possible circumstantial reasons that could lead him to do that. We've decided he's a bad guy. There's an interpretation of this that's consistent with the premise that he's a bad guy, and that was the interpretation people settled on. He has something to hide. That's the kind of guy he is. He's devious. He's got things to hide. So this is a small example, and I could give other examples, even that pertain to the Iraq War. But one thing I want to stop and emphasize is the question of why he had been defined as an enemy. Again, he was a bad guy, but it's also true that if you look at what happens in a country when it's preparing to go to war, the people who favor the war go to great lengths to describe the leaders of the country they want to invade in the most horrific possible terms. And one reason that's an effective strategy for them is this very reason. Once you've got people considering them the enemy, then there's kind of no way they can get out of that box. If they do something that's good, you'll go, well, that's not the real them. They're just like, that's a tactic, that's a trick, that's a response to this. If they do something bad, you'll go, yep, that's them, we got to invade. There's a social scientist who made this point in the context of this very thing, the fundamental attribution error. He said, his name is Herbert Kellman, and he wrote, thus, attribution mechanisms, that's his tendency to interpret people's behavior in certain ways, depending on whether they're a friend or enemy. Thus, attribution mechanisms promote confirmation of the original enemy image. Hostile actions by the enemy are attributed dispositionally, and thus provide further evidence of the enemy's inherently aggressive, implacable character. Conciliatory actions are explained away as reactions to situational forces, as tactical maneuvers, responses to external pressure, or temporary adjustments to a position of weakness, and therefore require no revision of the original image. And if you pay attention, to kind of Washington, you'll see this is happening all the time. Certain leaders of certain countries are being depicted in certain ways by people who want to kind of sustain enmity with them. And this can lead to war. So that's an example where I think exercising moral imagination, putting ourselves in the shoes of someone, just in the sense of perspective taking, not in the sense of feeling their pain, might have saved us a whole lot of horrible stuff. Now, I think we should apply this broadly, moral imagination, regardless of how bad we consider the person. I mean, Vladimir Putin is no saint, but I really think if we had done a better job of looking at things from his perspective, I personally think the whole Ukraine thing could have been avoided. I can elaborate on that in Q&A if you want, but I personally think that's the case. And I don't think it's just world leaders that we should work to understand the perspective of. So if you consider the case of young Muslims around the world, I think it's very much in our interest to understand if they feel alienated or if they hate the United States, to understand why, to try to understand that perspective, because for one thing, then you can avoid doing the kinds of things that make them more alienated, which is bad for us, or make them hate the United States more. And a good example of this is, you may remember the Charlie Hebdo thing. Okay, so Charlie Hebdo was the name of this satirical magazine in France that had, on a number of occasions, depicted the Prophet Muhammad in unflattering terms, to say the least. Ultimately, several Muslims, stormed the offices of Charlie Hebdo, killed a bunch of staffers. It was a horrible thing. And in the wake of that, there were demonstrations in France, in Paris, with people all over the country holding signs and saying, "We are Charlie Hebdo," or "I am Charlie Hebdo." This was a thing on Twitter, on Facebook. And what that meant, Charlie Hebdo was the name of the magazine. And I know what people meant when they said, "I am Charlie Hebdo, we are Charlie Hebdo." What they meant was they support freedom of expression. What they meant was no one should get killed for what they say or what they write. And I agree with that. And if that was the only interpretation of "I am Charlie Hebdo, we are Charlie Hebdo," I would have been saying it myself. But it did seem to me that if you take into consideration your entire audience, including young Muslims, especially young Muslims in Paris, well, old Muslims for that matter, all Muslims, if you ask yourself, well, what are all of these Muslims in Paris, how are they going to view it when people are walking down the streets of Paris with a sign that says, "We are Charlie Hebdo"? Well, I think it's reasonable to expect, given that the magazine Charlie Hebdo had just, it depicted Muhammad in the most graphically nasty terms, I think it's reasonable to expect that they're going to interpret that phrase, that the Muslims are going to interpret that phrase, "We are Charlie Hebdo," as saying you identify with this assault on Islam that they perceived as having come from the magazine Charlie Hebdo. It just seems obvious to me that a lot of people are going to read it that way. And so that's a case where I think, put yourself in the shoes of somebody. Leave aside whether you feel their pain. At least understand the way they are perceiving things, especially the way they're perceiving communication from you. It can maybe save you a lot of trouble. In any event, things have gotten only worse in Paris in terms of the dangers of extremist Muslim groups. Now, when I talk about this, this may sound so far like kind of like a left-wing doctrine, given the example, it's anti-war and so on. And I am on the left, but I want to emphasize that it's not the only way an emphasis on moral imagination can be read, because I favor extending it symmetrically. So in the case of Israel and Palestine, yes, I certainly wish more Israelis understood how deeply Palestinians feel their dignity has been assaulted by Israel. I also think it would be good if more Palestinians understood that Israelis feel genuinely fearful of terrorism. They genuinely think that if they, some of them, many of them, that if they allow the creation of a Palestinian state under any but the most stringently policed circumstances, that it will be a threat to Israel. So it works both ways. And similarly, I've spent a lot of time saying to white people, I don't think either you or I can know really firsthand what it's like to be, say, a young black guy who has reason to feel that police are looking at him in a different way than they might be looking at a young white guy. Or that when he goes into a pharmacy, the security guard looks at him more suspiciously. And I've argued we should try to understand what that is like and how that affects your perspective and the way you react to the world. At the same time, I think we should ask, what's it like to be a policeman? I personally think that some of the more lamentable things we've seen police do have more to do with fear than we might realize. It's kind of like the Israel situation in a certain sense. That's a suspicion of mine, at least. But in any event, I'm saying that I favor the radical extension of moral imagination to everyone. So to get back to Trump, I do wish Donald Trump's fans would ask themselves more like, what's it like to be an immigrant or somebody in Mexico who wants to have a better life and their family barely has enough to eat. At the same time, I think all of us should ask, well, what's it like to be one of these people who support Trump? How did they come to be that way? Why do they feel so alienated and angry? I just think, we should always try to understand everyone's perspective as broadly as possible. I don't think doing that would solve all the world's problems. Again, I'm not saying the absence of moral imagination is like the old-fashioned conception of evil. It's the source of all badness. But I do think if people were better at moral imagination, it would be a much better world. So anyway, that's my attempt to come up with something like a scientifically respectable theory of badness, at least the closest I could come to a grand unified theory of badness. I think a lot of the group conflict in particular would be less acute or could be diffused if we were better at exercising moral imagination. So that's, in a certain sense, that's my candidate for evil. It's and it's funny, actually, Augustine, I'm not an expert on this, I'm not a scholar of Augustine, but I gather that when he rejected the Manichaean view that there was this metaphysical source behind all evil, what he said instead, he said bad things are not the result of this force of evil, it's just the absence of good that causes them. And I might say something kind of similar, it's the absence of moral imagination that so often leads to bad things. At the same time, I don't really want to apply the word evil to the absence of moral imagination, and the reason is, I could try to define the word in my terms and get people to use it, but they're not going to, right? And they're going to keep using the word evil the way they always have. And I think often the way people use evil is, they use it to talk about people who are like so bad that there's almost no explaining their behavior. There's almost no point in thinking about why they did the bad thing. That's what the word evil means to people. So it almost discourages people from exercising moral imagination, from trying to figure out why bad people do bad things or why anybody does anything. So I'm really not trying to redefine the word evil. It's just more kind of an intellectual exercise that I've been up to try to ask the question, well, if you could fix one thing about the world, what would it be? This is my candidate. And I think I can pretty much stop there. I do want to say that I don't want to sound like holier than thou. I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing all the people in the world who fail to exercise moral imagination. It's very, very hard to do. A long time ago, I wrote a book about evolutionary psychology, which is just the field that studies how evolution has shaped the human mind. And the thinking is that evolution built into our minds these various cognitive biases that sometimes make it really hard to see clearly. And that includes this business that I was talking about of how viewing enemies and allies differently in terms of explaining their behavior, and not even realizing that you're doing it, okay? These cognitive biases, by their nature, are something that they're kind of invisible to us. They shape our thought without our being aware of them. So I'd say the first step is to try to make people more aware of these biases on their thinking. But even once people are aware, it's really hard. They're really subtle and deeply entrenched. And I guess I would say we all have our Saddam Husseins, right? We all have people that the way we feel about them makes it hard to think clearly about them. And in fact, for me, my own Saddam Husseins are some of the people who got us into that war still. I still have trouble thinking of Dick Cheney and George Bush with enough kind of equanimity and calm to kind of objectively appraise their behavior. Anyway, it's hard for us all. I personally think that to really make a lot of progress in this regard, to really get good at moral imagination, almost takes what you could call a spiritual discipline in some sense of that word. One thing I do is meditate. I have a daily meditation practice. I go on meditation retreats. I think that is that's somewhat helpful when I'm really sticking with it and being good about it and giving me a clearer view of the way. But there are other, there are things associated with all spiritual traditions that I think can be helpful here. And in fact, I kind of think that in a way, in all great spiritual traditions, there is this idea that we don't naturally see the world clearly. There's something we don't get right about the world, or we don't see the moral guidance that's out there, or there's something we don't see naturally, and it takes work to see it. It takes viewing the world in a particular way to see that thing. I think different spiritual traditions mean this differently, and I can talk about that if you want. But I do think embedded almost in the very nature of spirituality is this idea that it's partly about seeing things more clearly. I mean, there's the line in the Bible where Jesus says, "Why do you, what is it? Oh, hypocrite, why do you obsess over the speck in your brother's eye or the mote?" Scott would know this a lot better than I do. It depends on the translation what he says, but it's like, why do you obsess over the speck in your brother's eye or your neighbor's eye or something when you've got a log in your own eye? So, I think different spiritual traditions have their own ways and their own rituals and so on, their own ways of trying to clarify people's vision. But I think all of the great traditions are in some sense about that. I guess I would say that when you succeed at this, I think you're not just helping the world, you're helping yourself. I mean, I personally think that when you exercise moral imagination, your social relationships will go better, your romantic relationships, my marriage goes better when I'm actually doing a good job of understanding what's going on in my wife's mind. I think your professional life will go better. So it's also just a matter of self-help, I think. And it's, it can be really liberating, I think. I mean, when I come out of a meditation retreat, like a one-week silent meditation retreat, and I'm really at my kind of spiritually best, I have a very charitable disposition toward other people. I'm not as reactive against people who strike me the wrong way. It's just a great feeling. There's just a lot of baggage you're free of. And I think it's because you're seeing the world more clearly in a certain sense. Another thing Jesus said was, the truth will set you free. I think he was the first person to say that, at least on the record we have, and I think that's another thing he was right about. So thank you.